Imagine you're a Roman senator in 216 BC. In the span of 3 years, your republic has watched 3 of its armies get annihilated. Tens of thousands of your best soldiers are dead. The enemy is camped in the Italian heartland, and he just crushed your forces so completely at a place called Cannae that historians will still be calling it the perfect battle 2,000 years later. And yet, Rome didn't surrender. Rome didn't even seriously consider it. How is that possible? And how does the man responsible for all of that destruction, one of the most gifted military commanders in human history, end up losing the war? That's the puzzle at the heart of the Second Punic War, and the answer reveals something profound about the difference between winning battles and winning wars. To understand how we got to Cannae, you have to go back a generation. Rome and Carthage had already fought one brutal war over control of Sicily, and Rome had won. The First Punic War left Carthage humiliated, stripped of its Mediterranean island territories, and forced to pay a crippling indemnity. But Carthage didn't collapse. Instead, it pivoted. The great Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca took his armies to the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain, and began carving out a new empire. Silver mines, fertile land, and a vast pool of warrior tribes gave Carthage a new foundation for power. When Hamilcar died, his son-in-law Hasdrubal continued the expansion, and when Hasdrubal was assassinated, command passed to Hamilcar's eldest son, Hannibal. Hannibal had grown up in military camps. According to tradition, he had begged his father as a child to take him to Spain, and Hamilcar agreed only after making the boy swear eternal enmity toward Rome. Whether or not the story is literally true, it captures something real about Hannibal's entire life. He was raised for this conflict, and he was not content to wait for Rome to come to him. In 218 BC, Hannibal made one of the most audacious strategic decisions in military history. Rather than fight Rome on the sea, where Carthage was outmatched, or wait to be attacked in Spain, he marched his army overland through Gaul and across the Alps in late autumn. The crossing was catastrophic in terms of attrition. He lost a massive portion of his forces to cold, starvation, rockslides, and hostile mountain tribes. Roughly half his army didn't make it to the Italian side. By any conventional calculation, the campaign should have been crippled before it began. But Hannibal understood something the Romans didn't expect. Arriving in Italy at all, through that route, at that time of year, was itself a weapon. It shattered Roman assumptions about where threats could come from. It gave him the initiative before a single major battle was fought. The Italian tribes that Rome had recently conquered looked at this invader and saw an opportunity of their own. Hannibal presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, and that framing would prove critically important for the early phase of his campaign. Then came the battles, and they were extraordinary. At the Trebia River in December 218, Hannibal lured a Roman force into crossing a freezing river in the early morning, exhausted and hungry, and destroyed it with a perfectly coordinated ambush. The following year, at Lake Trasimene, he hid his entire army in the fog along a lakeside road, let the Roman column march into the trap, and then crushed it from 3 sides simultaneously. Around 15,000 Romans died in roughly 3 hours. The Roman commander was killed in the fighting. It was one of the largest ambushes in military history. And then Cannae, in 216 BC. A Roman force of perhaps 70,000 men, the largest army Rome had ever fielded to that point, faced Hannibal on an open plain specifically because the Romans believed overwhelming numbers would finally grind him down. What happened instead became the textbook example of double envelopment. Hannibal placed his weakest troops in the center, and his best cavalry and African infantry on the flanks. As the Romans pushed forward into his center, which bent but deliberately did not break, his flanks swung around, and the Romans found themselves surrounded on all sides. It was a killing ground. Between 50 and 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. Senior senators, consuls, and officers were among the dead. The scale of it was almost incomprehensible, and Rome still did not quit. This is the mystery that demands an answer. By any logic derived from the ancient world, Where a defeated people typically negotiated, submitted, or fragmented, Rome should have buckled. Other Italian cities and tribes did defect to Hannibal after Cannae, including the strategically important city of Capua. Philip V of Macedon saw an opportunity and reached out to Hannibal for an alliance. It looked, for a moment, like the whole Mediterranean balance of power was shifting. But Hannibal had a structural problem that no amount of tactical genius could fully overcome. He had marched to Italy without a siege train capable of reducing major fortified cities. He had supply lines that stretched across the Alps through hostile territory. He was fighting in someone else's country, dependent on local support that was always conditional and often unreliable. Every victory he won was geographically confined. He could destroy Roman armies in the field, but he could not deliver a killing blow to Rome itself, the city, the institutions, the Senate, the networks of Latin alliances that held the whole system together. Winning battles and winning wars are different problems. Hannibal solved the first one with breathtaking consistency. The second one required breaking Rome's political will, shattering its alliance system, and cutting off its ability to regenerate military force. And that, for reasons that go deep into what Rome actually was as a civilization, was something Hannibal was never quite able to do, no matter how many Roman soldiers lay dead on his battlefields. So what exactly was Rome made of, that it could absorb punishment on that scale and keep fighting? The answer starts with raw numbers, but it goes much deeper than that. Rome's manpower base in 218 BC was unlike anything else in the ancient Mediterranean world. The Roman census counted not just Roman citizens, but the Latin allies and Italian confederates bound to Rome through generations of treaties, shared institutions, and carefully managed loyalty. Estimates suggest Rome and its allies could theoretically mobilize somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million men of military age. That's not an army, that's a reservoir. Cannae killed perhaps 70,000 in an afternoon, and it was a catastrophe, but it was not an existential wound. Rome raised new legions within months. It put slaves in uniform. It recruited men below the usual property threshold. The Roman state had an almost biological capacity to regenerate military force, and every time Hannibal destroyed an army, he found another one waiting to replace it. But numbers alone don't explain why Rome kept fighting when surrender might have seemed rational. For that, you have to look at Roman political culture. The Roman Senate convened after Cannae and did something remarkable. It refused to ransom its own captured soldiers. Think about what that signals. Ransoming prisoners was standard ancient practice, a way to recover manpower and show mercy. The Senate said no explicitly as a political statement. We do not negotiate from defeat. We do not reward capture. And we do not recognize that this disaster changes our fundamental position. When a delegation from Carthage arrived carrying peace terms, the Senate refused to receive it. A dictator was appointed. Funerals were limited to a single day so grief would not paralyze the city, and the machinery of war was set back in motion. Roman civic identity, the idea that to be Roman was to endure, to persist, to win eventually, functioned as a strategic asset. It was almost impossible to break through conventional military means because it wasn't held together by fear of a king or loyalty to a single leader. It was embedded in institutions, rituals, laws, and a collective story Romans told about themselves. This is precisely where Rome found its answer to Hannibal's tactical genius. It stopped trying to beat him at his own game. The strategy that emerged, associated most closely with the general Quintus Fabius Maximus, was almost insulting in its simplicity. Avoid pitched battle, shadow Hannibal's army through the Italian countryside, cut off foragers, intercept supply parties, harass, delay, deny. Fabius earned the nickname Cunctator, the delayer, and it was initially meant as mockery. Romans were not culturally comfortable with avoiding battle. It felt like cowardice. The popular pressure that led to Cannae came partly from frustration with Fabian caution, but after Cannae, the strategic logic became impossible to dismiss. If Hannibal wins every time you meet him in the open field, Don't meet him in the open field. Make the war about time and resources instead of tactical brilliance, and suddenly his greatest strength becomes irrelevant. Hannibal could not easily counter this because of problems baked into the very nature of his expedition. He had no siege equipment capable of reducing heavily fortified Roman cities. This single fact shaped the entire trajectory of the war in Italy. After Cannae, he could march to within sight of Rome's walls. And he did in a later moment of the war that Romans remembered with terror. But he could not take the city. Without the ability to crack Rome's urban centers, he was left in a strange position. The most dangerous general in the world, camped in a country he couldn't fully conquer, waiting for the war to come to him. His supply situation was equally precarious. Unlike Roman armies fighting in familiar territory with access to established networks of grain and support, Hannibal's forces had to live largely off the land. That meant constant foraging, which kept his army moving, but also wore it down and made it difficult to project sustained force in any one direction. He had crossed the Alps with roughly 26,000 men after the mountain crossing's attrition. Reinforcements from Carthage trickled in, but never in transformative numbers. His army was always burning down from its own activity, and he could never fully replace what he lost. The defections that were supposed to cascade across Italy never quite materialized the way Hannibal needed. Capua came over, yes, a major city, symbolically important. Other communities in southern Italy shifted allegiance, but the Latin colonies, the backbone of Rome's allied network, held firm. Here is something that deserves attention. Rome had built its allied system with unusual care. Latin allies received genuine legal protections, shared in the spoils of Roman expansion, and had real stakes in Rome's survival. Hannibal could offer them freedom from Roman domination, but Roman domination had been, for many of them, a profitable arrangement. They calculated their interests and mostly stayed loyal. The alliance didn't crack at its core, and without that crack, Hannibal's liberation narrative had nowhere decisive to go. Meanwhile, Rome was doing something Hannibal couldn't fully answer. It was fighting the war everywhere at once. In Sicily, the defection of Syracuse to Carthage after Cannae opened a dangerous front, but Rome sent an army under Marcellus that besieged the city for 2 years and eventually took it, famously over the objections of Archimedes' war machines. In Spain, Rome kept the pressure on Carthaginian forces in the Iberian Peninsula, denying Hannibal the reinforcements his brother Hasdrubal was trying to send. This is critical. The war in Spain wasn't a sideshow. It was the plug in the drain. As long as Rome could tie down Carthaginian resources and armies in Iberia, Hannibal remained isolated in Italy, slowly consuming the alliance network he'd built, with no prospect of decisive strategic support arriving. And here, the comparison between Roman and Carthaginian war systems becomes damning for Hannibal. Carthage was a commercial oligarchy, and its commitment to supporting Hannibal's Italian campaign was always ambivalent. There were factions within Carthage that doubted the strategy, prioritized other theaters, or simply didn't send what was needed when it was needed. Hannibal had launched the most audacious invasion in his era and then found himself fighting it largely alone. Sustained by his own brilliance and the diminishing resources of southern Italian allies, who were increasingly exhausted by hosting an army that had no clear path to victory. Rome, by contrast, had a Senate that was institutionally committed to total war, capable of coordinating simultaneous campaigns across the Mediterranean, and drawing on the deep loyalty of a civic network that Carthage had no equivalent of. None of this diminishes Hannibal. Keeping an undefeated army in hostile territory for 15 years, without meaningful reinforcement, against an opponent of Rome's resources, that is its own kind of military marvel. But it does explain why the war settled into the shape it did. Hannibal, dominant in the south of Italy, gradually isolated, while Rome rebuilt its strength and looked for a way to change the terms of the contest entirely. And it found one. It found it in a young Roman officer who had watched his father nearly die at the Trebia, fought at Cannae, and come away from those disasters, not with despair, but with a burning question. What if Rome stopped fighting Hannibal in Italy and went straight for Carthage itself? That young officer was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he would become one of the most consequential military minds in the ancient world. What made Scipio remarkable wasn't just tactical skill, though he had that in abundance. It was that he understood something the Roman establishment had been slow to grasp. You couldn't win the war by defending Italy. You had to take the war somewhere. That forced Carthage to make impossible choices. Scipio didn't just adapt to the situation, he reimagined it entirely. He began in Spain, where Rome had been fighting a grinding war of attrition against Carthaginian forces controlling the Iberian Peninsula. In 209 BC, Scipio made a move that stunned everyone on both sides. He marched his army to New Carthage, modern-day Cartagena, Carthage's primary base in Spain, its financial hub, its supply depot, the city where Iberian hostages were kept as leverage over local tribes. He attacked and took it in a single day. The strategic shock was enormous. At one stroke, Scipio seized Carthage's war chest in Spain, freed the hostages and turned their tribes toward Rome, and announced to every Iberian chieftain watching that the balance of power in the peninsula had shifted. What followed over the next several years was a systematic dismantling of Carthaginian power in Iberia. At the Battle of Baecula in 208 BC and more decisively at Ilipa in 206 BC, Scipio destroyed Carthaginian field armies with tactics that deliberately echoed and inverted what Hannibal had done at Cannae, using his center to fix the enemy while his flanks enveloped and crushed. He had studied Hannibal's methods. Now, he was applying them against Hannibal's brothers. The consequences were enormous and direct. Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, had been planning to march reinforcements through Gaul and over the Alps to link up with Hannibal in Italy. A move that, had it succeeded, might genuinely have changed the outcome of the war. Scipio's pressure in Spain disrupted Hasdrubal's timeline and depleted his resources. When Hasdrubal finally did make the crossing in 207 BC, he arrived not with an overwhelming force, but with a diminished one, and he was intercepted and destroyed at the Battle of the Metaurus River by Roman consular armies before he ever reached his brother. The story goes that Hannibal learned of his brother's death when Roman soldiers threw Hasdrubal's severed head into his camp. If that is true, it must have told Hannibal everything he needed to know about where the war now stood. The hope of meaningful reinforcement was gone. By 205 BC, Spain was effectively finished as a Carthaginian theatre. Scipio returned to Rome not just with victories, but with a strategy that the Senate debated fiercely. He wanted to invade Africa directly, take the war to Carthage's doorstep, force Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy, and fight the decisive battle on terms Rome could control. There were senators who thought it reckless, Fabius Maximus among them. But Scipio's political capital and his record were undeniable, and he got his command. In 204 BC, he landed in North Africa with a Roman army and began ravaging the territory around Carthage, building alliances with the Numidian king Massinissa, and making it brutally clear that Carthage now faced the same choice Rome had faced after Cannae. Fight for survival or negotiate from weakness. The calculation worked. Carthage recalled Hannibal. After 15 years of campaigning in Italy, 15 years of keeping his army alive and undefeated on foreign soil without meaningful support, Hannibal was ordered home to fight the war he had always tried to bring to Rome. In 202 BC, the two greatest commanders of their generation met at Zama, southwest of Carthage. Hannibal came to Zama with a larger force and attempted before the battle to negotiate directly with Scipio, man to man, general to general. The conversation, if it happened as ancient sources describe it, was remarkable. Two men who understood each other's craft perhaps better than anyone alive, trying to find terms that would end the bloodshed. Scipio refused. Rome was winning now, and he knew it. At Zama, Hannibal tried to reproduce the conditions of Cannae. He used war elephants to disrupt the Roman line, placed his veterans in a final reserve line, and maneuvered for the encirclement that had won him so many battles. Scipio countered with almost eerie precision. He had trained his men to open lanes in the Roman formation, channeling the charging elephants through gaps in the line where they did little damage. He neutralized Hannibal's cavalry advantage by deploying Massinissa's Numidian horsemen, who drove their Carthaginian counterparts from the field, and then, crucially, returned to envelop Hannibal's army from the rear. The Roman infantry fought Hannibal's veterans to a brutal standstill in the center. Then the cavalry came back. The encirclement closed. Zama was Cannae in reverse, and Hannibal, the man who had invented that kind of destruction, watched it happen to his own army and could not stop it. Carthage sued for peace on Rome's terms. Hannibal survived the battle, and eventually Carthage itself, spending his final years as a fugitive, a brilliant exile pursued by Roman demands, until he took his own life rather than be handed over. He never stopped being dangerous, and Rome knew it. That says everything about the respect and fear that followed him to the end. So why did Rome win? Not because it had better generals. Hannibal was almost certainly the finest battlefield commander of his age, possibly of any age in antiquity. Rome won because it had something Hannibal could never fully overcome, a system built for exactly this kind of war. Resilience baked into institutions rather than depending on a single genius. A manpower base that could absorb catastrophic loss and regenerate. An allied network built on genuine shared interest, not just military domination. A strategic patience, embodied by Fabius, then weaponized by Scipio, that allowed Rome to endure punishment, deny Hannibal the decisive political victory he needed, and wait for the moment to strike where it hurt most. Hannibal won almost every battle. Rome won the war. And that gap, between battlefield brilliance and strategic endurance, is the deepest lesson the Second Punic War has to offer. Wars are not decided only on the days of great slaughter. They are decided by what a civilization is made of between those days, by whether its institutions hold, whether its allies stay, whether its leaders adapt, and whether it can outlast an enemy even when that enemy seems completely invincible. Hannibal came closer than almost anyone in history to breaking Rome. The fact that he didn't tells us more about Rome than any of its victories ever could. If you found this breakdown worthwhile, go ahead and subscribe. There's a lot more history like this coming, and you won't want to miss it. Hit the like button if this gave you something to think about, and drop a comment below. Could Hannibal have won? What would it have taken? I read every response, and that's a conversation worth having.